Hey guys, welcome to another week of Kids Church. Last week, you guys would have read about the big battles. Actually, not just last week, the week before, and the week before, the week before, and the week before that. You guys have been reading about the big battles that have been happening all throughout Joshua. In fact, last week, you would have heard about God even fighting alongside his people, Israel, in these battles. Now, after so many battles in chapters 1 through to chapters 11 that we've already read, most of the enemies of Israel have already been defeated. This week, we're going to be reading a whole 10 more chapters of the book of Joshua. 10 more! But because I don't have an hour for this video, we're just going to be looking at bits and pieces within these 10 chapters that give us an idea of what's actually happening in this whole chunk of text. Okay. While the first section was all about the battles that Israel had to fight in the Promised Land, this next 10 chapters is all about God. And it's actually all about God being true to his original promise. God being true to his promise to give Israel the Promised Land. In these 10 chapters, we see that God owns every little bit of the Promised Land. And this week, he's going to gift it to all of his children of Israel. That's right. God owns every bit of the Promised Land, and he's going to give it to his people as an inheritance. Okay, that leads us to the first of our word war words. Can any of you guys remember? This is an old one, actually. So if you can remember what it is, then you get a high five and my respect. Okay, so can you remember what the Promised Land was? I'm going to give you 5 seconds. It goes like 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. What is the Promised Land? Well, the Promised Land was God's people living in God's place with God as their king. For the Israelites, this was the land of Canaan that they'd been fighting in for the past few years. What about the Second World War word? You might have heard this word that I said before. It's inheritance. Do you know what an inheritance is? It's a pretty big word. Well, an inheritance is a gift that someone promises to give to you. So if your older sister has an old phone, she promises to give you this old phone when mum and dad give her a new phone. This old phone that she promises as a gift to you is called an inheritance. Now, the thing with an inheritance is that it's only as good as the giver really is. So for example, if your sister promises to give you this old phone, but you know that your sister always tells big fibs, then you're not really going to look forward to the inheritance. It's not that good because you don't even know if she's really going to come through on her promise. But if you know that your sister is the most trustworthy person ever, and she tells you, hey, I'm going to give you my phone as soon as mum and dad give me a new phone, then you're going to be so excited for your inheritance because you know that your sister is very trustworthy. Now it's the same with God. God had promised the Israelites the Promised Land as a gift, their inheritance. Now, he'd promised it to their great-great-grandfather. And this week, we're going to find out if God really is as good at his word, if he really is trustworthy, and whether it's really important to look forward to the things that we get from him as an inheritance. So those are the 2 word war words for this week. 1, the Promised Land. It's God's people living in God's place with God as their king. And 2, an inheritance, a gift that someone promises to give you in the future. Okay, so with that, we're ready to read through the 10 chapters of Joshua 12 through to Joshua 21. But we're just going to be reading 3 short passages from this. Okay, let's read from Joshua chapter 13. So Joshua was now very old. The Lord said to him, "You are very old, and there are still large areas of land that have not yet been taken over. Here is the land that remains to be taken over." And then he lists, Joshua, all the areas that Israel have yet to take. Philistia, Geshur, Shihor, Ekron. And then God said to Joshua, "I myself will drive out all the people who live in the mountain areas. These areas reach from Lebanon to Misrephoth-Maim. I myself will drive out these people to make room for the Israelites. Make sure that you set that land apart for Israel. Give it to them as their share, just as I have directed you. divide it up among the 9 tribes and half of the tribe of Manasseh. Give each tribe its share. So that's the end of our first part of the Bible reading. So to summarize, there is land left to be taken by the Israelites, but God promises here that he's going to be the one himself. God himself is the one who's going to drive out the people remaining, and then he's going to give every bit of the promised land to the tribes of Israel. Okay, moving forward to Joshua 14. Let's read from Joshua chapter 14. Now, the rest of the tribes of Israel received their shares of the land in Canaan. Eleazar the priest and Joshua the son of Nun decided what each of the tribes should receive. The leaders of the tribes helped them to make these decisions. The shares of the 9 tribes and half of the tribe of Manasseh were decided by casting lots. That's what the Lord commanded through Moses. Moses had given 2 tribes and the other half of the tribe of Manasseh their shares of the Jordan River. But Moses had not given the Levites a share among the other tribes. The Levites didn't get any share of the land. They only received towns to live in and grasslands for their flocks and herds. So the Israelites divided up the land just as the Lord had commanded Moses. So that's the end of our second part of the Bible reading. To summarize, the land was divided among Israel by Eleazar and Joshua by casting lots. This is kind of like rolling dice. So every tribe was given land except for the tribe of Levi, and that's because this was the tribe that would become priests, and the other tribes would take care of them as well. So before we go to the last part, there are six more chapters talking about how the land is supposed to be divided. After the dice are rolled, the lots are cast, and they're divided among the nations. There's very clear instructions about like the borders of where the land's going to be divided and who's going to get what. 6 whole chapters. That's how big a deal this was. The reason why the Bible spends so long on this, actually a good way to describe it is like this. Imagine that you receive a toy robot as your present for your birthday. And when you get it, you can't stop talking about it. In fact, you talk non-stop for hours about all the buttons, all the cool little things that it can do, and you would want everyone to know every single detail about this robot. You talk about it for ages. This was exactly what it was like for the Israelites to receive the promised land. They'd been hoping for this for so long, for years, for generations and generations. And the great inheritance that God had promised had finally been given to them, and they couldn't stop talking about it. 6 chapters. So skipping forward all the way to chapter 21, after all the land has been divided and the borders have been described, the book of Joshua puts it all together like this. Let's read from Joshua chapter 21, verse 43. So the Lord gave Israel all the land that he had promised to give Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Israel took it over. Then they made their homes there. The Lord gave them peace and rest on every side. He had promised their people of long ago that he would do that. Not one of Israel's enemies was able to fight against them and win. The Lord handed all their enemies over to them. The Lord kept all the good promises that he had made to the Israelites. Every one of them came true. And that's the end of Joshua 21. So, to summarize, all the land is given to Israel. There's peace on every side. Every enemy is defeated, and every promise is kept. A great and glorious inheritance, a great and glorious gift is now theirs. And here is the big idea from today. It goes like this. God is true to all his promises. He owns every bit of the promised land, and he gives it to his people as an inheritance. One more time. God is true to all his promises. He owns every bit of the promised land and gives it to his people as an inheritance. Okay. And they lived happily ever after. The end. Jokes! That never happened! I missed a really important part of the passage. In the middle of this very happy ending to the story, there are hints, small hints in the passage, that Israel hadn't actually done everything that God had commanded. At the end of chapter 14, after Joshua had taken almost all of the land of Canaan, the book of Joshua actually says this. Let me read. Moses had won the battle over Sihon and Og. He had taken over their land, but the Israelites didn't drive out the people of Geshur and Maacah, and so they continue to live among the Israelites to this day. So what's happening? Instead of doing what God said, which was to drive everyone out, what Israel actually do is there's a small group of people that Israel do not. They leave them there. They actually disobey God and they leave God's enemies living in the land of Canaan. Why is this a big deal, you might ask? Well, actually, later in the book of Joshua, and even later throughout the story of the Old Testament, we'll actually see that this small bit of disobedience of leaving this small group in Canaan actually leads to big, big consequences for Israel. This small group of people may later, spoilers, they may turn God's people away from God altogether. But that's for another day. So just to remember, this week we learned that God keeps all his promises and he gives the promised land to Israel. But in the background, we also know that Israel have this slight disobedience to God that one day might come to bite them in the butt.